For centuries, the story of Richard III has lived suspended between recorded history and whispered legend, a tale woven from medieval chronicles, political propaganda, and Shakespeare's dramatic imagination. Yet beneath the noise of myth and accusation, there has always remained a deeper, unresolved mystery, one that no historian, no battlefield excavation, no dusty manuscript had ever been able to answer definitively. But everything changed the moment scientists finally isolated DNA from the skeletal remains discovered under a nondescript parking lot in Leicester, because what began as a straightforward attempt to confirm the identity of a long-lost king quickly spiraled into a genetic revelation capable of shaking the very foundations of British royal history. As researchers meticulously reconstructed Richard III's genetic profile, they stumbled upon something far more unsettling than any chronicler's accusation of tyranny or murder. They uncovered a biological secret that threatened to unravel royal legitimacy, dethrone centuries of lineage, and expose a hidden fracture in the ancestry of one of the most powerful dynasties to ever rule England. And as this truth emerged from the cold silence of bone and genome, it became clear that what Richard III's DNA revealed was not just a scientific curiosity. It was a revelation with the potential to rewrite the history of monarchy itself. When the scientific team began analyzing mitochondrial DNA extracted from the remains believed to be Richard III, the goal seemed almost modest. Align genetic sequences with those of two living individuals descended through an unbroken female line from Richard's maternal family, thereby providing definitive proof of identity. Yet beneath this seemingly standard process lay a far more substantial risk, because DNA is indifferent to political convenience and historical storytelling. It simply reveals whatever truth it carries. A perfect match would solidify genealogical continuity, preserving the carefully maintained narrative of royal succession. But a mismatch would have consequences far beyond academic debate. A mismatch meant that somewhere across centuries of royal history, a moment of false paternity, a discreet affair, an illegitimate child passed off as heir, or a politically motivated substitution, had disrupted what the monarchy had always insisted was a pure, unbroken line of descent. And if that occurred, then what was at stake wasn't merely Richard III's authenticity. It was the credibility of every monarch whose legitimacy relied on the assumption that lineage, not politics, determined the rightful ruler. The stakes therefore rose far beyond archaeology. This was a question about national identity, the stability of dynasties, and whether the blood that shaped English and later British history was, in fact, the blood that was meant to be there. As the mitochondrial DNA results emerged, the research team found themselves staring at a revelation no one had anticipated, because instead of alignment, instead of the elegant biological confirmation everyone expected, the sequences did not match. This wasn't a trivial deviation or a statistical margin. It was a categorical contradiction that meant Richard III did not share the same maternal line DNA as the living descendants who, according to decades of genealogy, unquestionably should have matched him. In a single moment, the clean, linear narrative of Plantagenet descent fractured. This type of genetic discordance could only mean one thing. There had been a false paternity event somewhere in the royal line, a moment, hidden, unrecorded, undetected, in which the biological father differed from the claimed father. And that realization reopened questions historians had tried to settle for generations. Was this discrepancy the result of a quiet scandal buried behind palace walls? Had a politically motivated union masked an affair? Or was it a desperate attempt to secure succession by inserting a child who biologically did not belong to the reigning dynasty? Suddenly, the sanitized version of royal history ruptured under the weight of molecular truth, revealing a complexity no historian could ignore. What made the discovery even more unsettling was not merely the existence of the genetic break, but its ambiguity in time. The false paternity event could have occurred in the generation directly preceding Richard III, or 17, 18, even 19 generations earlier. That frightening temporal uncertainty meant that the rupture potentially predated the Wars of the Roses, the rise of the Tudors, or even the establishment of foundational medieval lines of rule. The consequence is staggering. Entire branches of royal succession, centuries of political conflict, marriages arranged to secure alliances, and wars fought to defend hereditary claims may have been built on a lineage that, genetically, never existed. The notion that queens, princes, and even iconic monarchs might derive from a biological line unrelated to their official ancestry forces a re-evaluation of how power was claimed and maintained. This wasn't merely a personal revelation about Richard III, it hinted at systemic hidden truths within medieval aristocracy, where political survival often demanded secrets, and where the facade of perfect lineage could easily conceal biological reality. The DNA evidence didn't simply expose a break in inheritance, it illuminated the possibility that English history itself may have unfolded atop a silent, centuries-old deception. As scientists mapped the range of possible historical timelines in which the false paternity event could have taken place, one chilling conclusion grew impossible to ignore. If the break in the bloodline occurred at a critical juncture, such as before the emergence of the Tudor dynasty, then the legitimacy of monarchs celebrated worldwide, from Henry VIII to Elizabeth I, could be biologically disconnected from the line they supposedly inherited. While this does not mean the throne itself collapses, it does mean that the mythology of royal blood, a concept that shaped coronations, political alliances, and national identity, may never have been as pure or as stable as history textbooks imply. The climax of this discovery is simple yet seismic. The DNA extracted from Richard III's bones does not merely tell the story of a single king. It challenges the biological foundation of an entire royal narrative. And once genetic truth enters the discussion, historical certainty becomes far less certain than anyone, scholar or monarch, would be comfortable admitting. As historians, genealogists, and geneticists confronted the implications of this fracture in the royal lineage, an unsettling realization began to spread through academic circles. The discovery threatened not just the personal story of Richard III, but the entire conceptual framework upon which hereditary monarchy had been constructed. Because if legitimacy was built on blood, and blood itself was now uncertain, then every coronation, every royal decree, every war justified in the name of rightful succession became vulnerable to reinterpretation. Imagine the cascading effect. Alliances forged between kingdoms could have been negotiated under false assumptions, treaties signed in the belief that royal bloodlines preserved divine or ancestral right may have been grounded in error, and entire political movements, like the Tudor rise to power, might have relied on genealogical claims that, genetically speaking, were foundations of sand. This wasn't about changing a footnote in history, it was about re-evaluating centuries of national identity, calling into question how many branches of the family tree were politically constructed rather than biologically inherited. The DNA did not simply expose a secret. It forced a generation of historians to reconsider whether the story of English monarchy was shaped as much by hidden paternity and strategic concealment as by lineage and tradition. The deeper researchers delved into the historical records surrounding the time frames in which the false paternity event could have occurred, the more they began to notice something chilling. The medieval aristocracy was rife with strategic marriages, politically arranged unions, and family alliances in which personal choice mattered far less than geopolitical advantage. In this environment, secrecy wasn't an anomaly, it was a tool. Court scandals were suppressed, rumors conveniently erased, and children born in ambiguous circumstances could easily be absorbed into the lineage if it served political needs. Suddenly, the DNA mismatch didn't look like an extraordinary deviation, but rather a window into a widespread pattern of concealed inheritance that medieval sources, eager to preserve power structures, had carefully hidden. The discovery revealed not just one fractured link, but the possibility of many fractured links, each buried beneath layers of political necessity. And this insight re-engaged the public in a way few archaeological revelations ever could, because it suggested that royal history, so often portrayed as pristine, orderly, and divinely guided, was instead entangled in human flaws, passions, betrayals, and deliberate manipulations. The genetic break became more than a data point. It became a metaphor for the hidden fragility of power. As computational models assessed the probability of when the lineage break occurred, one scenario emerged as particularly disturbing: the possibility that the disruption took place during the period leading into, or within, the powerful House of York itself. If so, then the very war that Richard III fought, and died in, during the Battle of Bosworth might have been waged by a man whose biological claim to the throne was unknowingly compromised. Imagine the weight of that revelation. A king who fought to defend the legitimacy of his crown may have never possessed the genetic right that medieval society deemed essential for kingship. And if this applied to Richard, could it not apply to Edward IV as well, whose paternity had already been hotly debated by chroniclers of his time? The DNA results reopened these old controversies with new scientific force, transforming whispered medieval accusations into scientifically grounded questions. It meant that battles, rebellions, royal propaganda, and Tudor justification for seizing power might all have been rooted in a biological truth hidden beneath centuries of chivalric myth. In this light, the Wars of the Roses become not merely a dynastic conflict, but a struggle whose very premise may have been biologically flawed. With every genetic revelation, one conclusion grew increasingly unavoidable. The image of monarchy as a flawless chain of biological inheritance had always been a myth. Science had simply provided the first irrefutable proof. Richard III's skeleton, long buried beneath layers of earth and historical distortion, had become a catalyst for exposing the uncomfortable truth that royal dynasties were never as unbroken, pure, or divinely ordained as they claimed. Instead, they were vulnerable to the same human complexities as any family: infidelity, political coercion, hidden relationships, and desperate strategies to preserve power at all costs. The final unraveling of royal myth was not a sudden collapse, but a slow recognition that history, once illuminated by genetics, tells a more intricate and far darker story than the polished chronicles suggest. And as scholars pieced together the implications, it became clear that this discovery did not simply revise the legacy of one king. It challenged the foundational narrative that monarchy itself relied on. Richard III, through the silent testimony of his DNA, had exposed a secret that stretched across centuries, reshaping our understanding of ancestral truth and political power. As we reflect on everything uncovered through the DNA extracted from Richard III's bones, it becomes impossible not to confront the profound implications these findings have forced upon our understanding of royal history. Because what began as a simple identification procedure evolved into a revelation so powerful that it pierced directly through centuries of myth-making, political storytelling, and the carefully cultivated illusion of unbroken hereditary rule. The discovery that a false paternity event occurred somewhere within the 19 generations surrounding Richard III doesn't merely challenge the legitimacy of a single king. It compels us to reconsider the entire architecture of monarchy, a system that has long justified its authority through the purity of lineage and the sanctity of blood, only to have science reveal that these foundations were far more fragile and far more human than historical narratives ever admitted. When we allow the weight of these genetic truths to settle, we realize that history, stripped of its propaganda and ceremonial grandeur, reveals a world where royal succession was not the flawless, divinely endorsed process it pretended to be, but a complicated chain shaped by secrecy, desperation, strategy, and centuries of decisions hidden from the public eye. The skeleton under the Leicester car park did more than confirm the identity of a fallen king. It exposed the silent fractures running through the story of an entire kingdom. And so, reflecting on these findings, we must reconsider not only the narratives we were taught about Richard III, but the broader implications for how we interpret power, legitimacy, and the truthfulness of historical memory. DNA has allowed the past to speak in a language that cannot be censored, rewritten, or manipulated for political convenience, and in doing so it challenges us to read our history not as a polished legend but as a living, evolving investigation, one where every discovery reshapes what we thought we knew. If you found this journey into genetic history and royal mystery as fascinating as we did, make sure to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss the next revelation that could rewrite everything we think we know about the ancient world.